Hello and welcome to the webinar. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to Tending to the Emotional Well-Being of Your School Community webinar event. My name is Patrice Williams, and I'm thrilled for all of you to be with us today. Now I would like to know who actually is in the room with us. So please take a quick minute to introduce yourself by entering the following information into the chat. If you could enter your name, your location, your role in the educational sector, and then do a little meme check-in with us by entering how you're feeling today. So you can just use the chat and put in the number that best corresponds with your mood. And if you're not feeling any of these, just go ahead and put a word in to describe how best you're feeling. And while you're doing that, I want to inform you that this webinar is being recorded. All webinar registrants will receive a follow-up email that will include this slide deck recording and resources mentioned during the presentation. Please use the chat feature if you're experiencing any difficulties or have any questions. My colleague Carrie Krause is available to assist you with any troubleshooting or questions you may have. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this event. However, if a question arises during the presentation, please do not wait because you might forget. So go ahead and enter it into the Q&A box and we'll be sure to get to it during the Q&A session. Here's our agenda for today. After brief introductions, we'll talk about building community and professional learning. We'll learn who CASEL is and a bit about SEL, the roles and relationships play in key settings. Then we'll share strategies. Then we'll wrap up with a bit of Q&A. I'm so very pleased to introduce today's presenters. Today we have with us Heather Schwartz. Heather is a practice specialist at CASEL. She works to help define and identify high quality SEL programming through her work on the CASEL program guide. Heather also contributes to the continuous improvement of CASEL's resources and professional learning, with a special focus on SEL and academic integration. Next, we have Tyrone Martinez-Black. He is a practice integration specialist at CASEL, and he seeks to solidify the connections between research, practice, and policy efforts. Prior to joining CASEL, Tyrone taught middle school math and science. He continues to deliver learning experiences on a range of topics, often intersecting mathematics, equity, and SEL. So excited to have both of them here with us today. So this is the fourth webinar in our Connected and Engaged webinar series. The initial charge was to create a series to help us launch the Connected and Engaged site. But as we began this process and selected partners for each event and engaged in focus groups and Twitter chats to hear from education leaders around the country, we very quickly realized that it was about more than just driving traffic to our site, and that it's also about building community and a method of professional learning. So I just want to take a moment to thank our partner presenters. We've learned so much from you during this planning of this event. And I also want to thank all of you out there listening and those who participated in the Twitter chat, as we've already begun this very important conversation. So today we're going to focus on the role of social emotional learning in the school system, in the school setting. To borrow CASEL's words, in partnership with families and communities, schools play a central role in supporting young people's social and emotional development. A school's focus on SEL is what creates a supportive environment full of learning and positive relationships. Whether students feel connected relates to their academic success and success in other areas. Currently, there are two major opportunities in US education. One is that the COVID-19 pandemic has emphasized the need and importance of supporting student and adult social, emotional well-being and mental health. And two is the American Rescue Plan. There is a once in a lifetime opportunity to invest in long-term strategies to better American education. So with that, I'm really excited to turn it over to the perfect partners to talk through what all of this means for us and for all of us who are invested in schools. So now I will turn it over to Heather.
Hi, we are thrilled to be with you at whatever part of your SEL journey you're on. You're choosing to spend your precious free time engaging in a webinar around tending to the emotional learning of your school community. So we feel some kinship with you already. For the next hour, we're going to provide some food for thought and actionable strategies. But before we dig into that, I'd like you to think about a young person in your life and really call up one person to mind. It can be a family member, someone you've taught. From your perspective, what types of educational experiences will support them so that they can contribute to their community and thrive? And we'd love to hear from you in the chat. And just in general, throughout, we'd love to hear your voice in the chat as much as possible. I think especially in these remote times, this is one way to get a little closer to feeling like we're in community together. Thanks, Jean. See, listening and compassion. Belonging. Wellness. A sense of belonging, trust, and emotional safety. Great. Thank you. A lot of good stuff coming in for folks to just scroll through the chat, to be seen, self-awareness. Great. So a little bit about us as an organization. CASEL is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that first coined this term and defined it, SEL, over 2 decades ago. And we see the field as an ecosystem. So much of our work is overlapping. We see that things that happen in one area impact the rest. So we're working on translating research into action through field tested tools and district partnerships. We inform SEL policies along with state and federal policymakers. And we bring the field of SEL together to broaden understanding and SEL adoption. So take a moment to read through CASEL's definition of SEL, which we recently updated. And once you've had a moment to absorb it, I'd love to hear from you in the chat, one word or phrase that jumps out at you. Any words or phrase standing out? I know we often hear empathy. Thanks, Monica. Empathy. Seems especially relevant these days. Empowering young people. Advances educational equity. A lot of people are feeling that empathy. Authentic. Manage emotions, co-create, empower. Thriving schools. Healthy. Operationalizes tending to humanity, supportive relationships, authentic. Great. Thank you so much for engaging. It's always interesting to hear what resonates with people. So SEL can and does advance multiple key priorities for schools and districts, including mental health. When we create supportive learning environments that meet students' need for connection and belonging and agency, it can help to strengthen mental health initiatives. Still, we feel like it's really important to emphasize that SEL would not replace counseling or other targeted mental health supports for students. And I called this one out specifically because that does seem to be a line that gets blurred for people and sometimes needs some clarity. At its heart, we come back to the definition we shared with you and that you commented on. SEL is for everyone, students and adults. It's an asset-based part of healthy human development. We're going to take a moment to look through these CASEL 5 competencies. Some of you may be seeing these for the first time. For some, they may be very familiar to you. So I'll give you just a moment to read through them. And as you are, just a few things to note. The competencies are interconnected and often inform and influence one another. So for example, my capacity to be self-aware and know my own values will greatly impact my capacity to make responsible decisions that align with those values. So even though they're separated out, really when you look at how they show up in your life and the lives of your students, they're really very interconnected. And these competencies can be taught and applied at various developmental stages from childhood to adulthood across diverse cultural contexts, though the way they look can differ depending on age, stage, culture, and context. So on the next slide, we'll show you a little bit more about what these can really look like in practice. So as we mentioned, the 5 competencies are interrelated and they often build on each other. And we want to share some examples of how they might show up. This is not an exhaustive list, so we'll take a moment to read through them. Just take a look at self-awareness, and there'll be some examples that pop up that include things like having a positive sense of self and identity, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, look through self-management. So I'll let you just look through these. Again, these are not exhaustive, and you may be able to think of others right off the top of your head that could fit into these categories. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to keep working this chat. I hope you all stay with me, but it's really fun to see what you say. So thinking about what you shared at the beginning of this presentation about this student and the kind of experiences you want them to have so they thrive. Curious what competencies feel like they're aligning with what you're envisioning. Is there any competency that sort of pops out as like, yes, this is especially important for them? That's social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision making is coming up for Michael right now. Self-management, relationship skills. And even just, man, scrolling through the news, sometimes I feel like if as adults, we could manifest some of these a little bit more. Yeah, all of them, Naomi. What a difference it would make in our civic society. All of them. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So at CASEL, we see SEL as an ecological model. So our framework emphasizes the importance of establishing equitable learning environments and coordinating practices across these key settings. So there's classrooms, there's going to be one ring outside of this wheel of competencies, schools, families, and then communities. This will all enhance students' social, emotional, and academic growth. And it's really important that we are recognizing the bidirectional impact of systems on students and families and vice versa. So there are, as we all know, a range of upstream stressors that impact students' emotional well-being. Inadequate access to resources like food and housing, neighborhood violence, experiences of racism, all have the potential to negatively impact young people who've been historically marginalized. But we also know at the same time that young people and their families are often very well positioned and currently doing the work to call out and transform the system that creates these stressors. So think of it more as a conversation that's moving in and out. Now, so we've explored what these competencies are, we've explored the key settings, but the next question that we get a lot is like, okay, I'm bought in, but what does this look like in practice? What would you see in a school that's doing this? So you're going to see 10 indicators that help paint a picture of what we might see in a school that's made a long-term commitment to systemic SEL. I'll give you a moment to read through them. You can see these happen at the classroom, school, family, and community level. It's not a to-do list or a checklist that you would tackle one indicator at a time. Think of it as a landscape painting as we're talking about ecosystems, that what happens in one area can influence the others. Thank you for that question, Reese. So yeah, we'll come back to that at the end. So I'm noting that. So this webinar is about tending to the emotional well-being of your school. And we propose that relationships play a major role here. Relationship building isn't something that just happens at the beginning of the year, hopefully, but it's important throughout the entire school year and all activities. These relationships can set the stage for authentic engagement by fostering an environment of trust where everyone believes they'll be heard and that their input will matter. But that does take a certain kind of flexibility and humility on our part as educators, so that we're learning and growing ourselves, even as we are supporting the growth of our students. And that in turn requires that administrators create an environment that promotes learning, collaboration, and healthy relationships for staff. I want to read out this quote just because I think it's a really important one. Fundamentally, as every teacher knows, this job of education is a human one. It's about relationships. When teachers are able to prioritize relationships and focus on the quality of their connections with kids, we see over and over again the teachers feeling more effective and the kids being more engaged, learning more, and feeling more effective. Robert Pianta, in creating opportunities through relationships. And this actually wasn't in my original thoughts for this, but I'm just thinking as I'm reading, when teachers are able to prioritize relationships, and I just started to reflect like what's necessary for that, because some of it has to do with the adult capacities, right? The teacher's capacity, but some of it does have to do with the environment. How hard is it to prioritize relationships if you are in a deluge of testing? I mean, that was my experience. So just thinking about what do we need personally to prioritize relationships and what do we need systemically to prioritize relationships. And just to keep working this connection between the role of relationships and environments that support educational equity, I want to share another quote from our friends at the National Equity Project. The promise of a social and emotional development as a lever for increasing educational equity rests on the capacity of educators to understand that all learning is social and emotional, and all learning is mediated by relationships that sit in socio-political racialized context for all children, not just those who are Black or Brown. I think that we hear a lot from the field, a sort of dichotomy that happens between academics and SEL. And when you think about your real experiences learning in a deeply engaged way, I don't think that, for me, that doesn't hold up. So as we were designing this webinar and thinking about well-being, this idea of co-creation came up a lot, and it's something we're talking about a lot at CASEL. It's an important part of building engaging, equitable schooling experiences for all students, and it relies on supportive, trusting relationships. Why does it matter? So for one, we all have limited vantage points, and bringing in families, students, and communities as collaborators widens our apertures. So it helps us to generate more inclusive solutions to the challenges we're facing as a community. It also helps to create connection and belonging for all the members of the school community. I'm curious in what ways you feel like your school has been successful in hearing from multiple voices throughout the past year. And we know this year past few years have been so disruptive. Are there any ways that you feel like your school has done a good job in being able to hear from multiple stakeholders? Let us know so we can borrow and steal your ideas. Revamping the implementation of PBIS. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. Okay, next slide. Parents participate in school improvement team. Recommitting to restorative practice in circles. Re-examining advisory programs, a weakness at your school. Good to be able to identify that. Build the SEL muscles with your staff first. Yeah, I think that's totally right, Patrice. Sometimes there's certain teachers that can really serve as an example for the rest of us. Just do it really well. Yeah, and that integration of SEL and instruction. Wow. You hired a lot of SEL coaches to help. That's great. Good. Well, I just learned a lesson about needing to practice my wait time, because if I had really moved us on, I would have missed all this. So just wanting to anchor us again in the 10 indicators of school-wide SEL, just to keep us oriented. So this next section, we're going to be looking at supportive school and classroom climates, an indicator that falls within the school and classroom rings of the SEL wheel. And so as we're thinking about co-creation in the classroom specifically, and we think about what it means and what it takes to create a learning community together with our students. So we'll be sharing a few tools and resources with strategies in just a bit. But before we get to these tools, we just wanted to pause and think about the mindsets that are necessary. And these are probably mindsets that you embody much of the time. From my experience teaching, it got more challenging the more stressed out I felt. And we know this is an especially challenging time for educators. So I just recommend giving yourself some grace as you work to embody these competencies necessary to share power and form community. And these are strategies that we think support academic learning, but also support student wellness by prioritizing agency and belonging. This is a ladder of student engagement, which is just a nice visual to think about the ways that schools involve young people. The bottom three are non-participatory. Basically, students are used to support adult initiatives. And while they might give the feel sometimes of like being youth inspired, young people really don't have a ton of influence at those levels. The middle three youth are in more of an advisory role. So either they're informed of how they'll be involved, or adults and students are making decisions with equal vote. And then the top two are about youth really taking the reins and taking the lead to move these initiatives forward and make decisions. And that top one, youth and adult equity, calls out the ways that often in order to move change, especially at the policy level, young people do need adults to use their power to support the initiatives that young people have brought forth. And we're not saying that you have to be at the top of this ladder every day in every way. I think that would be really hard, but we do feel like up is the right direction. And that means paying attention to the opportunities we create for students to contribute, paying attention to which students get to contribute, and just thinking about the daily relationship dynamics between students and adults. So we wanted to do a quick poll reflecting on your overall experience as an educator. So it could be now in this school or just what you've seen through the entirety of your career. What approach have you seen most often used to engage students? You got to use your voice. I see that I can't vote. And if it's easier, you can feel free to put it in the chat too. Oh, there we go. Okay, that's really interesting. So nobody selected the student adult equity, but we did have some people who have some completely student driven initiatives, which is great. This feels like what we see a lot where people tend to be around the middle. So there's some effort to engage students, but we have work to do to make it really student driven. So before I hand off to my incredible colleague, Ty, I just want to share a few resources that might be helpful to you on your journey, creating a classroom where students feel a sense of well-being and belonging. You'll have access to these slides, and these are all clickable links. So the first is a learner autobiography. It's a tool that asks students to reflect on their prior experiences with schools and their current perceptions of schools. Understanding where our students come from and what they value can help us meet them where they are. The classroom shared agreements are a tool to help you ask students what they want their classroom to look like, feel like, and sound like. The 5-minute chats with students we've pictured on this slide. It provides an agenda and questions for one-on-one check-ins with students. Those can be focused on their experiences inside or outside of the classroom, really depending on where the student leads the conversation. So connection is the goal there, not necessarily getting one kind of data. And lastly, we have a tool to help set up class meetings and community circles. And this tool was created specifically for middle school, high school, and it can be used to support social, emotional, and academic learning. So hopefully those will be helpful to you. Most of them come from our school guide, which is free and online. And I will hand it over to Ty. Muted. You're muted.
I know. So thank you, Heather. So one of the questions that arose in the chat was about looking at those rings and thinking about why, for example, families and caregivers are located where they are with respect to the maybe presumed young person at the center of the diagram. And I think I want to just call some attention to that as an assumption often, that the core competencies, the CASEL 5 that we often refer to, often are connoted as solely belonging to a single person. And so with that in mind, these are systemic SEL implementations within a school. So the first kind of setting for that young person is likely their classroom, where they'll have the more regular and intimate relationships with colleagues, with peers, and with adults. Then schools, of course, is a larger ecosystem for that. And then beyond the school is then when families and caregivers would be engaged, and then broader still would be the communities. I want to give some respect to a person's perspective that some of that can be inverted entirely. That we could say that social emotional learning and those developments of those skills and knowledges begin at home, and in the community, and then in school, and then in the classroom, right? So the order is solely because frankly, the positions have to be somewhere. But as Heather described earlier, they're all interrelated, and we make no mistake that they are separate and distinct. In fact, what we hope for in this, my part of this conversation, will give some highlight to the fact that partnership with family must be indeed authentic and a significant part of a systemic approach to social and emotional learning in a school. So what we'd like you to do here is consider then your own experience when you were younger. And do you recall a family member or another caring adult who may have been outside of the school, in the community, in larger relations, that engaged with your school on your behalf, perhaps, right? Or in support of you and your learning? If you are currently a parent or a caregiver to some young people, or you're clearly engaged in a young person's life, how do you expect to be received as a partner with that young person in the school? So right now, we're going to give you a good amount of time to describe some of those experiences in the chat. Yes, so I hear a clarification about how you expect to be received. So I am a parent to now 2 adult women. And when they were girls, I had the responsibility to work with them and the school to make sure that they learned well. I expected, as an educator myself, for those doors to be open to me to do that for them. I expected for teachers to respect my voice. I expected for the principal or other staff to hear my input with some level of receptivity. And I expected for them to honor the nature of the conversation when it came back to indeed interacting with my girls. So that's hopefully some examples of what I mean by being received by the school. So in the chat, we're seeing that indeed there were varying degrees to which our parents were available or could engage with the school, but there were certainly events or occasions where that was welcome or invited. And then we see also that now as parents, we want to be heard. We want to feel like we're welcome to contribute to the learning of our own children. And we want for the school to respect our wishes when we're trying to essentially protect and advocate for the best interest of our children. And so we hold on to that idea that, in fact, for a strong family partnership, we want to solicit that input, right? As a school, as a collection of educators and leaders, we want to know what are the preferences and the needs that families and caregivers are bringing to us when we're working with their children. We want to be regularly collecting some of that input in formal ways. Sometimes it's a survey or a focus group or something like that, but we want to be sure that we're listening. And as a component of some of the trust that and the empathy that you expressed earlier, we need to act upon that input in some fashion, or at least give reasons why we might not be able to take an action at this immediate time. So that two-way communication is helpful, and certainly we expect for that to happen. And we know that some families, however, might face challenges with that. So we look to a model. Dr. Karen Mapp is one of our colleagues who has done extensive work in examining and making recommendations about what to do with respect to building authentic partnerships. And she calls it a dual capacity building framework, which means essentially that as educators, we have some rules and some policies about reaching out to families. We should make phone calls, we have parent-teacher conferences, there might be a PTA, but we don't actually receive a great deal of training about how to indeed build a welcoming culture and how to go beyond formality when it comes to building those relationships. On the other hand, families are in their homes, maybe not having had the best experiences with school themselves, growing up and then raising their own children with some distance. In fact, sometimes in fear or mistrust of what schools are designed to do, and so are not eager to engage with schools. Certainly work, life, and other kinds of commitments make it difficult to be a part of school during the school day, and so on. So in a dual capacity understanding, we would engage in building conditions, working toward policies and programs that allow us to join together and co-create, as Heather phrased earlier, co-create the equitable learning environment that we each want for the young people that we're taking care of. What we also know is that Dr. Mapp is engaged with two other organizations, at least, in the Family Leadership and Design Collaborative and the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement. Two slightly different approaches to really forging some bridges between caregivers and the school level adults. On the Design Collaborative, very thoroughly ecological, community responsive, and so on. The National Association building on some of the tools that we're familiar with, kind of like parent-teacher councils and advisories, local school councils, and things like that. Flamboyant Foundation is another entity that has supported deep research into family engagement, and the websites that I provide here will give you access to many of their resources and some of their framings so that you have better understanding of how to engage and why you might want to. So at CASEL, we want to recognize that authentic partnerships with families and caregivers, as Dr. Mapp's framework expresses, are varying in their enactment. And so we have here a kind of continuum offered by the, the book Beyond the Bake Sale. And in that we see from fortress schools where we are intentionally distancing from parents and caregivers. In fact, as the name connotes, we're barring them from any kind of real participation. Then come if we call, as the name implies, suggests that we want engagement, but only really on our terms as school members. Open door schools start to become a little bit more inviting, where there may be greater opportunities for parents to perhaps volunteer or chaperone events, sit in classrooms, but a partnership school is one in which there's genuine co-creation, co-design, co-governance of how the school operates. In a short form, a way for parents to be at the center of driving some decision-making with respect to policies and practices that go on in the school. And so, of course, that takes maybe some unlearning, some relearning, some empathy, again, as you all raised at the top of our time together, and the beliefs that as educators we might hold so that we can display to caregivers that we want for their partnership to exist. We hold there, this comes from the California Parent Engagement Guide, toolkit for family engagements. All families, even in this climate that we hear lots of disagreements about how exactly this should happen, all families want their children to do well. All families indeed have a capacity to support their children's learning. Families and school staff then need to be equal partners. Families and the home and communities where young people reside are their first place of learning. And so when they come to schools, the expectation would be, as some of you expressed, that perspective, that lived experience should indeed be recognized and respected. And so as a school, as an institution of learning that has formal authority and power, the responsibility for building and sustaining those partnerships returns to school staff and school leaders, because we have some built-in conventions about where authority resides and where power resides with respect to learning. In order for there to be authentic partnership, school members will have to indeed take some first actions to reestablish indeed a welcoming climate and culture where parents and young people can voice their concerns and give direction to how they're learning. And so partly, we highly recommend via our district resource center and our school guides, ways of building those relationships. In particular, if we want common knowledge, that is, we want for the school staff and the adults in homes and in the community to work toward the same goals, then we have to work toward understanding the same terms and the same pillars of how we're operating. And so these three questions are some guiding ones for how to make that happen. You may start with, what are the avenues for communication? Often we have a parent newsletter or a location on our website where we do our best to inform parents of what's happening within the school, but that's unidirectional. What we don't always have are very sophisticated ways for parents and caregivers to communicate back to the school, to offer concerns, questions, or demands, frankly, about how the schools should be receiving their young people. A second question would be, The second question would be how families participate on the SEL team. So if your school is indeed trying to have a systemic SEL practice, then do families physically sit in the team? Do you have representation from those families so that a voice from the community can be heard? And does the school provide opportunities beyond that for families to learn more about SEL and contribute to social emotional learning within and beyond the school? And so the links here speak to some of those questions and what you might do to try to resolve them, particularly the second link, which is a discussion series that offers parents an opportunity to lead one another in understanding social emotional competence and the ways that schools approach that same competence. And so we conclude at least our part of this conversation by returning to that student, that young person that you had in mind from the start, and what it might mean indeed for educators, school staff, school leaders to begin considering sharing power with those students and families, authority to decide, the domain to make choices. What would that ask of us then? And you can offer in the chat, and I know we'll be going to questions and answers. But if you take a moment, what do you think would be necessary for us to start working toward this new authentic partnership in our schools?
Thank you, Ty, and thank you, Heather. So absolutely, I think if we could take this time to reflect and answer this question into the chat, and then also go ahead and enter any questions you may have, and we'll kind of do a reflection / Q&A simultaneously. That would be great. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
In the chat, I see releasing fear of losing control, trusting that our students can and will step up when we give them leadership opportunities and share power. Trust. Here's a reflection. What does power sharing with students and families? Oh, a deep understanding of co-creating in partnership by teachers and parents. Wonderful. Heather, if we could return to that earlier question we had. I'm scrolling up to find it.
Was that the one about the rings that Ty touched on?
I believe so. It was, let me find it. So go ahead and enter any questions you have into the Q&A.
Yes, I think I see Mary here talking about deep understanding of co-creation, which I think connects very well to Marcia's offering of full transparency, right? The revisiting of a vision and mission in the school that actually includes young people and caregivers in creating.
Wonderful.
And then Nancy.
Oh, go ahead, Heather.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Nancy, I see a question about other recommendations for resources. And I will say, I mean, there are so many, including the ones that Ty linked to other organizations, but in terms of CASEL, the school guide that we have online has so much, and it's divided into 4 key focus areas for building out systemic SEL, which includes supporting adult SEL in our schools. We also put out something that we did in partnership with over 40 other organizations, Reunite, Renew, and Thrive. I can try in a second or maybe someone else can just find it online, but it is really thinking about going back to school after we released it a little while ago, after this time remotely, and how we can prioritize relationship buildings and healing from so much tumult for our students and adults.
Perfect. We also have a question that Risa put both in the chat and the Q&A box. Thank you so much, Risa. And the question is, you shared a few tools and resources to support the strategies. Do you have any recommendations for places to find additional resources?
Oh, that's the one I think we just answered.
Oh, you just answered that. You're correct.
But the other question is also about building and sustaining partnerships and the responsibility being with schools, especially school leaders. And how might we recommend schools prioritize this, or engage in discussions about that?
And I think some of it is just helping school leaders understand the benefits. There's so much benefit, and research bears it out, that these kinds of connections are healthy for students, to have more integration between family cultures and kinds of knowledge and schools, and also the benefits to schools, as we mentioned, to help with our own blind spots. So, I mean, it really is win-win. And I'm sure, Ty, you have probably some other thoughts on that too.
Certainly. So when I referred earlier to Flamboyant Foundation, for example, they have a wonderful report about a study they did in family engagement, and they cite many other studies and researches about how important family engagement and participation in school life significantly impacts the academic well-being, certainly, of young people. So in instances where schools have family members regularly engaged with the school life, not even necessarily making decisions, just involved, students' performances on assessments, their general overall school climate improves, and so their overall performance throughout their school life is improved. What we build upon then in the conversation about shared power is simply to say that we are a very diverse society, and we cannot take for granted that the way schools have operated historically adequately captures the wide array of experiences, heritages, languages, ways of being that are moving in and out the school. So it becomes important then, if what we want is authentic partnerships, to first and foremost identify some of our biases, right? Some of our ways of being, some of our own cultural identities, belongings, and so forth, that in fact reflect our own self-awareness and self-management, right? Our social awareness and our relationship skills as adults. So in doing that, we make room for our own equipment, right? Our own tools to be strengthened, so that when we have family nights around curriculum, or when we have parent-teacher conferences, or when we have summer learning experiences for young people, we then have greater skill at inviting families to participate in those events, right? To help, in fact, design and drive how they're organized. Sorry for the brief example here, but when I was teaching and then when I was coaching in a school district, family math nights shifted from being a place where we teach families about the math and we show what we're doing in math classes. And it started to become about how families understand math, period. Where do families use math? And so there started to be a co-creation of the learning experience where we asked for parents to come to the school with their own expertise. So that's a simple example of where you can begin in some structures that may already exist within your schools.
Excellent. Ty, thank you so much. I am so upset that we are at time. I feel like I would love to have a whole session just on co-creation. So perhaps we can have the two of you back and continue this conversation. I would absolutely love that. So thank you all so much. I have put all of the resources here on this slide. And I just really appreciate all of you for coming. I just want to reiterate again, we do have a site, Connected and Engaged, and we have a new guide up called The Comeback, where you can access all of these wonderful resources we talked about. You can access all of our previous webinars and resources on all of those webinars there. And we will also send you a follow-up email with this slide deck, the recording, contact information for Heather and Ty and myself and my team. And we just really appreciate all of you coming together for this very important conversation. And we hope to continue it all. So thanks, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.